I thought it was a work event. That was the pathetic excuse given by Boris Johnson today in Parliament to explain how he attended a party in his back garden without realising it. We are going to be talking all tonight about the scandal that could bring Boris Johnson down. We'll also briefly talk at the end about the latest in the Prince Andrew case in New York. The judge has made a decision against him. Before we continue, if you like chatting in the live YouTube chat, do make sure you refresh your window. I'm told that will help if you are struggling right now. And we do love to hear your comments and questions. You can tweet them on the hashtag TiskiSour, or after you've refreshed your window, put them in the comments box. Oh, I should also say I'll be joined by Dalia later on in the show. On the 20th of May 2020, Britain was 2 months into its first lockdown. Strict stay-at-home guidance, which meant people were only allowed to go out for food, medical supplies and daily exercise, had been eased only 7 days earlier, and people were still only allowed to meet one other person from outside their household. That was so long as they were in an outdoor public place and if 2 metre social distancing was maintained. Also, on the 20th of May 2020, Britain's Prime Minister attended a party to which 100 people had been invited. The email invitation, which was from Johnson's private secretary, Martin Reynolds, told would-be guests to bring their own booze. That email was linked this Monday, and for 48 hours, Boris Johnson refused to confirm or deny whether he attended that rule-breaking event. But with pressure mounting, today, in a pre-prepared statement before PMQs, he broke his silence.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. And though I cannot anticipate the conclusions of the current inquiry, I have learned enough to know that there were things we simply did not get right. And I must take responsibility. Number 10 is a big department with the garden as an extension of the office, which has been in constant use because of the role of fresh air in stopping the virus. And when I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside. I should have found some other way to thank them. And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way, people who suffered terribly, people who were forbidden from meeting loved ones at all, inside or outside. And to them and to this House, I offer my heartfelt apologies. And all I ask is that Sue Gray be allowed to complete her inquiry into that day and several others so that the full facts can be established. And I will, of course, come back to this House and make a statement.
So, an admission and an apology, but with two important caveats. He said he believed implicitly the party was a work event, and he suggested that technically the party may well have fallen within the guidance at the time. On that first claim, there were at least 30 people drinking alcohol. Boris Johnson's private secretary invited 100 people. His wife was apparently there drinking gin and tonic, yet he didn't realise this was a social event. He thought that perhaps this was a necessary work meeting. No one else's necessary work meetings look like that, Boris Johnson. It's also difficult to see how it would fall even technically within the guidelines that were in place at this time. We've already explained the laws that were in place. For social reasons, you could only meet one other person from outside your household, but there were exceptions for work. But here, the guidelines kicked in, and they were that workers should try to minimize all meetings and other gatherings in the workplace. Only absolutely necessary participants should attend meetings and should maintain 2-meter separation throughout. And then it also says of workers, they should reduce the number of people they spend time with in a work setting where they can. So clearly, a gathering of whether it's 30 people or 100 people, if they're meeting after work to get drunk, snacks, booze, you're not following the guidelines. So Boris Johnson's apology, it's hollow. His excuse is completely incoherent. After the Prime Minister's statement, Keir Starmer went in on the attack.
Well, there we have it. After months of deceit and deception, the pathetic spectacle of a man who's run out of road. His defence that he didn't realise he was at a party. It is so ridiculous that it's actually offensive to the British public. He's finally been forced to admit what everyone knew, that when the whole country was locked down, he was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the point that he's making about the event that I attended. I want to repeat that I thought it was a work event, and Mr. Speaker, I regret very much that we did not do things differently that evening. And Mr. Speaker, as I've said, and I take responsibility and I apologise, Mr. Speaker. But as for his political point, I don't think that he should preempt the outcome of the inquiry, and he will have a further opportunity, Mr. Speaker, I hope, to question me as soon as possible.
I want to repeat that I thought it was a work event. Now, I'm not sure, Boris Johnson, if you really do want to keep repeating that, because it makes you sound like either a barefaced liar or an absolute fool. I mean, probably both. I think most of the public are probably looking at that and thinking, this is an idiot liar. He's lying and he's an idiot because he thinks people will believe this absolute nonsense. There were 30 people there. They were drinking booze. 100 people were invited. How could you turn up to that? And not just think, because I think there's a slip of a tongue here, which is to try and confuse the public, because Boris Johnson is saying, I thought it was a work event. Now, under some understandings of the term, that was a work event. Like I'd often call work drinks a work event. But what it wasn't was a necessary work event. It wasn't somewhere where people were working. It was a social event connected to their workplace. So it was absolutely 100% against the guidelines, 100% against the spirit of the law. So absolutely zero defense. And the more he keeps saying that, it reminds me a little bit of Theresa May's "nothing has changed" line. The moment it is said, everyone instantly knows that is completely ridiculous. If you're enjoying tonight's show, do hit the like button. And I want to go to a tweet we got before we started from Neil Channing. I love Tisky Sour, but on the really big days for politics, I really love it. Thank you so much for that comment. N. Kamara with a super chat has also said, has a child written this? This apology is as believable as a kid claim that their homework was eaten by a dog. Very interesting point. I saw actually Adam Wagner, who's sort of a lawyer who covers lockdown laws, suggesting that the wording of this was potentially intended to not implicate Boris Johnson in having broken laws. So even if it is implausible to the public, it might give him plausible deniability when it comes to any official investigation, which is why I have no faith whatsoever in this investigation by Sue Gray, because I think probably what she will decide, just as every other investigation has decided into Boris Johnson, is that we don't have hard and fast evidence that he has broken some rule or broken some law, but he's just made a mistake. Now, if you want something beyond reasonable doubt, in a court of law, maybe that will stand up. Maybe this plausible deniability, well, I find it quite implausible, to be honest, but maybe these denials will work. They won't work when it comes to the court of public opinion, because they're obviously completely ridiculous. One of the reasons it's ridiculous is because people who were working in Downing Street at the time realised that this was not a work event, and they had their own questions about it. We can all see this wasn't a necessary gathering, and so could they. Laura Kuenssberg has been shown some messages as to what people in number 10 were saying at the time after receiving that email from Martin Reynolds. So messages from staff members included, "Is this for real?" And "Why is Martin encouraging a mass gathering in the garden?" So these are people who worked in number 10 who, presumably reasonably intelligent, and they recognised that inviting 100 people to a drinks party in the garden when we were at that time in lockdown was a bizarre thing to do, something that was not on. They got it for some reason. A very senior civil servant, Boris Johnson's personal private secretary, didn't understand that. And apparently Boris Johnson, who, as we know, attended the event, also didn't understand that. Or again, he's lying. Pick which one you prefer. Dominic Cummings also put his 2 cents in today. So he tweeted, "Whole point of why I and other official told Martin Reynolds, WTF you doing holding a party, was because the invite, which was obviously totally social, not work, unlike all the meetings in the garden." This is Dominic Cummings saying that the meetings in the garden I was pictured at, they were not parties. This was clearly a party. And the evidence it was a party was that email, which was inviting 100 people to what was clearly a social event. He goes on to say, "No way technically within rules. And the trolley," which is what he calls Boris Johnson because he's constantly changing his mind, "is bullshitting because the alternative is admitting he broke the rules and resigning." He clearly doesn't want to do that. Now, whether or not you trust Cummings, the idea Boris Johnson couldn't tell he was attending a party is laughable. As you can tell, if you go on social media today, absolutely no one is buying it, and that includes Ryanair. Now, we don't normally share tweets by airlines on this show, but I thought this one was pretty good. It's using the party meme where you've got someone in the corner who's normally saying, "They don't know something about me." This one, it's Boris Johnson saying, "I don't know, I'm at a party." So much of that, like Twitter is awash with that, and I'm sure WhatsApp groups around the country are as well. This isn't just a Twitter story, it's quite the opposite. And the anger and ridicule this has all sparked has clearly spooked some senior Tories. Douglas Ross is the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. He today called for Boris Johnson's resignation.
Yesterday, if the Prime Minister attended this gathering party event in Downing Street on the 20th of May, then he could not continue as Prime Minister. So regretfully, I have to say that his position is no longer tenable.
Douglas Ross was joined by Ruth Davidson, so she was the previous leader of the Scottish Tories. She tweeted, and this was quoting Douglas Ross, "A tough call to make, but the right one." And there are so far 19 Scottish Tory MSPs actually, which is crucial, are calling for Johnson to go. It's crucial they're MSPs because they don't actually get a vote in triggering a leadership election. That's the Tory MPs in Parliament. We need 15% of them to hand in a letter calling for Boris Johnson's resignation, and then he would have to lose a vote of confidence to stand down. You might remember Theresa May won. She survived one of her votes of no confidence, but it could be a different situation this time around. In terms of Tory MPs, the people who matter when it comes to forcing a resignation, this was Tory backbencher William Ragg today. So he said, "Unfortunately, I wasn't reassured by what Johnson said at PMQs. I fear this is simply going to be a continuing distraction to the good governance of the country. And I'm particularly concerned as a Conservative MP with the interests of the country, my constituency, and the Conservative Party, that a series of unforced errors on matters of integrity are deeply damaging to the perception of my colleagues and the party, and that is deeply unfair to them. As colleagues are saying to one another on and off the record, I sadly think the Prime Minister's position is untenable." I should say that that quote I just read from you was from William Ragg, who is vice chair of the powerful 1922 Committee of Tory Backbenchers. So that's the committee that gauges opinion from backbench Conservatives and basically represents them in Parliament. So if a leadership contest were to happen, it would be via that very organisation. I'm going to go to a few more comments. Saul, the only reason Boris is on the way out is because Thatcherite Tories want to move away from tax and spend policies and shrink the state instead. It's an interesting comment. The downside of Boris Johnson being forced to resign is that he will probably likely be replaced by someone who is economically more right-wing than him, someone who is more fact-right than Boris Johnson, who doesn't seem to be particularly ideological when it comes to the economy. Boris Johnson doesn't seem to be personally opposed, for example, to measures to combat climate change. He doesn't seem to mind about big spending. If he's replaced by, for example, Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, they are more concerned about those things. We would more likely get a more right-wing government. Whether that's what's motivating the people who want to bring Boris Johnson down, I'm a bit less sure. My guess would be that the vast majority of Conservative MPs would have been more than happy to continue with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister if they thought he was going to win the next general election. What they're worried about now is that maybe he's not going to do that. I suppose the other question, the other thing you might be intimating towards is who is leaking, who is doing these leaks and what is their agenda. Now, it's been pointed out by many people that, not only are these leaks, the content of them very damaging, but the timing is just so expertly done that it's kept this story going and going and going. So the Christmas party, people were asking, why was that leaked a year later? Now, I think there's an important question there. Why wasn't it leaked at the time? I assume there were some lobby journalists that knew about it. If they leaked it at the time, that would have been extremely damaging for the government. But I can see why whoever leaked it might have leaked it in December instead of October. That's because in December, we were already talking about Christmas parties. The government were having a debate about whether or not members of the public would have to cancel theirs. So it was particularly damaging to leak that then. Leaking this email here, and the information that Boris Johnson was at that party is all the more damaging because Boris Johnson has spent the last month or so denying there were any parties. If this had all come out at exactly the same time, it would have been less damaging than the drip approach we are currently seeing. I've got no idea who is leaking it, but I suppose well done to you. Boris Johnson's admission that he was at a party on the 20th of May, but thought it was a work event, has prompted ridicule across the country. However, for many people, the Prime Minister's rule breaking is anything but funny. That's because while the PM was bending the rules to attend a garden party, they were following the rules and missing out on more fundamental, even heartbreaking moments in life. Jim Shannon is an MP for the DUP. In the House of Commons on Tuesday, he asked this question to a government minister.
In Northern Ireland, we reached a milestone of 3,000 deaths due to COVID just last week. 3,000 people who followed the rules and grieved today. So will the paymaster, including my mother-in-law who died alone, will the Paymaster General confirm that there will be a full and complete disclosure to enable the police service to ascertain that all was done decently and within the regulations at the date and at that time? I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker.
That powerful testimony was echoed across the country by people who lost loved ones to COVID-19. They include Lisa Wilkie, whose brother was in intensive care on the date of the Downing Street party. He died shortly afterwards.
Instead of holding my mum, I was holding my phone, filming my brother dying. People sacrificed so much. People died sticking to the rules, and they broke those rules to have a bottle of wine.
On Tuesday, the BBC also spoke to a woman who lost her mother to COVID. Her mother's funeral was held on the day of the Downing Street party, and due to lockdown rules, she was unable to attend.
We went there. There was just a coffin.
So what do you feel about the Prime Minister having a party that
I'll be honest
day?
with you, I really hate him. I'm sorry to say it, because my mum wouldn't want me to say that. But he's just a disgrace. I mean, he's not said sorry. He doesn't acknowledge what he's done. He lies and lies and lies. And it's just, it's a disgrace.
Both of those testimonies were played on the BBC News at 10. So that's the most watched news broadcast in the country. 5 million people tune in. And we all heard that woman who tragically lost her mother say from the bottom of her heart, I hate him. About Boris Johnson, I hate him. Dalia, I want to bring you in at this point. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen footage that's more damaging for a Prime Minister than what was on the BBC News last night. Multiple people who have lost loved ones to a disease which he mishandled and which he broke the rules he set and then lied about it. I mean, what do you make of it?
I cannot imagine what it must have been like to lose a loved one, especially during that time, and to know that the government was behaving in this way. And I want to take this opportunity, actually, because I think it's important that all of us who did abide by the rules, all of us who, despite how difficult it was, stuck by our principles, and who are maybe feeling now, why did I bother? But watching the footage that you just aired really reminds me that, and it's important to remember, that we did the right thing. We shouldn't regret the fact that we did abide by the rules, even if this government was making essentially a mug out of us. We saved lives by respecting the scientific advice, even when the government didn't have the dignity to do it. We are better than our government. And it's important to remember that, especially when morale is so low, because we feel, as I said, like we've been taken for a mug. And, this is an incredibly damaging footage. And what boils my blood on top of it is to think about when you look at the email invitation and it said, given the incredibly busy period we've had, we thought it'd be nice to make the most out of the sunshine. And I just think when I read that, I not only think about the people who couldn't hold their loved ones after they were mourning the loss of people that in their family or their friends, but I thought about the NHS workers, the workers who had to endure, talk about working hard, talk about a busy period, who worked in, frankly, traumatizing working conditions because of this government's haphazard response to the pandemic, and who were told just this Christmas, oh yeah, the NHS is going to be under a lot of pressure during Christmas and January, but we're not going to put down any restrictions, even though Scotland, Ireland, etc. have. Many of those workers have had to isolate, especially during that earlier period before vaccines. They had to isolate from their families and their friends. Even after spending a day in an ICU ward, they'd have to come home and spend the whole night in their room so that they didn't infect their families. I'm sure that they would have loved to have blown off steam or spent time with their friends and loved ones in order to recover from what they were going through, but they didn't. And that's going to have long-term effects on so many of them. And, if they didn't deserve to socialize after a, quote, pretty busy period, then this lot sure as hell didn't. And so that sort of adds another layer of insult on top of what people who have lost loved ones and who grieved during that period, now that we've found out what the government was doing with the trust and the responsibility that was put in them. It's disgusting.
I mean, I suppose the best defense they have is that they just didn't think about it. Because if they thought about it, if they thought about the implications of this and thought, yes, we know that people are missing funerals and we know that people are not visiting their loved ones, but we're still going to have a party anyway. I mean, that would be almost, sociopathic. So either it's that, or they just weren't really thinking at that point in time about the people who weren't able to see their dying loved ones. They weren't really thinking about the mental health problems that so many people were having because they weren't able to see their friends for 2 months. It just wasn't on their minds. And these weren't people with jobs that were irrelevant to that. This wasn't fine if that's not on your mind and you work in sports journalism or you work in a food factory. You don't need to be worrying about everyone in the country who is unable to see their dying relative. You don't need to have at the forefront of your mind the people who are suffering from mental health problems because they've been unable to leave their house. If, I contend, you work in Downing Street, you are making these rules, your entire job is to supposedly look after the country, then those things should be at the forefront of your mind. And either they weren't at the height of the first lockdown, the height of the crisis, they weren't thinking about what other people were going through in the country, or they thought about it and had a party anyway, which is, so inexcusable, it's almost difficult to imagine. Let's go to a couple of comments. Becca A comments in the chat, I missed my dad's funeral and my 40th birthday. Our mate was living in a caravan working as a nurse. I'm so angry and sad about this. Wow. I'm really sorry to hear about your dad passing and missing his funeral. Those sentiments which you're expressing there are just held by so many people across the country right now. And to speak about this on a purely sort of more political level, I think what's so interesting in this case is that it's such a broad cross-section of society who are angry about this because, yes, the idea that COVID didn't discriminate at all, it did discriminate. It did hit working class people harder. It hit non-white people harder. But most people know someone who died from COVID-19. And that Boris Johnson has been so disrespectful to all of them, I think, is why this could end his career. Which actually relates to this next comment I want to go to, which is from Spectre Dub on Twitch, who says the most depressing thing about this country is that it's all damned if you do, damned if you don't. Oh, actually, I was going to go to a different comment than that for this one, because there was someone who said that it annoys them that it's the case that attacks on the disabled, attacks on other various minorities haven't brought down the Conservatives, but this could. I think that's partly because of this situation where this is pissing off such a broad section of society. They can't just say, oh, this is some small minority we can demonize, which is obviously morally abject if they do it, but it's politically possible for them to do it this time around. I'll go back to that Spectre Dub comment. They say the problem is if Boris Johnson resigns, the replacements are closer to fascism and austerity, and if he sticks around and loses to Starmer, then the country just gets more bland neoliberalism. Potentially. I mean, I think if Boris Johnson's resignation leads to Labour winning the next general election, that is a net good thing. The bigger worry is that he gets replaced by someone who's, even more popular than himself, which would, in this situation, be Rishi Sunak. Let's go to our next story. The stream of revelations about Downing Street parties suggests that for the past 2 years, the Prime Minister has had quite a lot to hide. And, if reports are correct, there have been people in his office going to worrying lengths to try and hide it. So this is an independent report. They say that 2 Downing Street sources were told by senior members of staff, or a senior member of staff, that it would be a good idea to, quote, clean up their phones, given the multiple investigations being launched into lockdown parties. The sources claim it was suggested to them they remove any messages implying they had attended or were even aware of anything that could, quote, look like a party. The Independent report that one said they were told to clean up their phone just in case they had to hand it to the investigation, and a second said, I was being lent on during the discussion with a senior colleague and told to get rid of anything that could look bad. Both sources told The Independent they felt under pressure to delete communications and images. Dalia, it's often said a cover-up can be worse than an original crime. Do you think that's the case here?
I mean, yeah, I think the problem here is what impact this is going to have on public confidence when it comes to the possibility of needing further restrictions. How can this man and his government come out in favor of restrictions or tell people we need to implement restrictions, which will probably happen over the next couple of years? We're not out of the COVID woods yet, when we know that this is the kind of contempt that he holds for the very restrictions that he introduces. And I think that now that the cat is out of the bag, that flimsy excuse of, I thought it was a work event, it actually makes it worse. Because one of the key reasons why this is such an insult to the people in this country, apart from the actual party itself, which of course deeply insulting, it's the unreserved and bold-faced lying that has occurred from start to finish, that we have been subjected to from start to finish. And the audacity of the Prime Minister to avoid the question by saying, oh, I need to check with Sue Gray before I can answer whether or not I attended this party. I need to ask another person whether or not I attended a party or not. Treating the population like they're idiots. People don't like to be made out to be dickheads. They don't like to be taken for a mug. And I think insulting our intelligence in this way adds insult to the original injury. And I think that this is where the issue is so much bigger than just what seems to be one of many parties. But the lying and the corruption and the cover-up that has happened in the wake, it shows us that the people who have been running this country during a pandemic are far more interested in what they can get away with and how they can enrich themselves, how they can continue their business as usual, rather than in the well-being of the people in this country. And we've seen that throughout this pandemic. We've seen it in the handing out of lucrative and essential contracts to their business owning mates. We've seen it in them refusing to implement restrictions in order to continue this very abstract notion of the economy that basically just means enriching business owners. We've seen this attitude, which is, rather than how can I protect the population and minimize the amount of struggle and damage that this is going to do to people, but it's been how can I make a quick buck and how can I get away with basically continuing my life as possible. And, when it comes to will Boris Johnson actually resign as a result of both the party and this cover-up, the corruption in the wake of it, I have no idea. He is a scrappy bastard. He is resilient, but he must, because as I said, we're not out of the COVID woods yet. Chances are that over the next few years, we are still going to need the British public to on and off abide by some form of restrictions. And this man has no authority anymore when it comes to asking people to give things up for the broader public health causes. And that's dangerous because having that collective confidence, being able to announce restrictions when they're needed and have collective trust that we're all following those guidelines, that those guidelines are necessary, is incredibly important to public health. And Johnson just doesn't have that authority anymore. So will he do the decent thing? I don't know, but it is a public health risk at this point for him to not resign.
I think probably something we can be sure of is whatever he does, it won't be because he wants to be decent. If he leaves, it will be because there is literally no other avenue left to pursue. Lauren with a $5 really important super chat there says, thank you for the reminder that we were right to try our best to save lives. That kind of reassurance is needed in these strange and frustrating times. And UBI Stories tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. It doesn't matter why he leaves, just that he leaves. Politics is the art of the possible, and circumstances don't often align well enough to get rid of a sitting prime minister. I basically agree with that. If you don't like the prime minister, you can't want him to stay in place just in case he gets replaced by someone worse, or because you prefer him to have fallen for a different reason. This is what is really pissing off the public. This is the one opportunity. Well, we might get more of this. This is a opportunity to get rid of Boris Johnson. They don't come up that often. So I'm all in favour of let's have justice on this particular issue, even if there are other issues on which we didn't have justice. Let's go to our next story. After it was revealed Boris Johnson attended a garden party in the first COVID lockdown, not many Tories would come out to defend him. In fact, for 48 hours after the incriminating emails were first leaked, every one of Johnson's cabinet colleagues appeared to boycott TV interviews. There was one man, however, who was willing to put his neck and wig out. Michael Fabricant.
Look, from the rules point of view, that's going to be decided by Sue Gray and the Metropolitan Police, and we'll have to see what happens. What I'm trying to explain is that Boris and others felt sorry for people who are working long hours, and they were simply spilling out from their own offices into a secure garden, which is an integral part of number 10 Downing Street. And you know what? I'd rather have a prime minister who felt for his staff and all those hard-working people than some cold fish who really couldn't care a toss about.
They felt sorry for staff members who were working long hours, and if Boris Johnson hadn't let them have a party, he'd be showing himself as a cold, wet fish. Well, you know who else was working long hours? Doctors and nurses in A&E were hospital bosses being cold, wet fish when they didn't lay out spreads of booze and snacks for hospital staff. People in care homes were working very hard. Were the bosses at care homes being cold fish when they didn't let the staff have spreads of sausage rolls and gin and tonics? Let's watch some more of Michael Fabricant.
So many people, who were prosecuted and felt they were breaking the rules were because there was the risk of them mixing with other people whom they wouldn't have otherwise met. These were the same people who had actually worked in tight offices where, of course, the risk of contagion, as we know from Boris's own infection, the risk of contagion was far higher, in fact, far less so in an open space like the garden. It is, I think the whole point, perhaps, that will be looked at by Sue Gray and the Metropolitan Police is, was that garden which is a walled garden with armed police patrolling outside, was that garden an integral part of the office space? Clearly, that was the view taken by some people who decided to get involved in that.
What absolute nonsense. First of all, it doesn't make a difference whether or not the garden was part of an office space. Social events were banned. If they took place in an office, they were banned. If they took place in a pub, they were banned. If they took place in a house, they were banned. It didn't matter where the social event took place. If it was a social event, which this was, it was banned. It makes absolutely no difference whatsoever whether or not one considers a garden part of an office, which is quite implausible anyway. Second, Fabricant is suggesting the party wasn't a problem because all the attendees would have been working together anyway. There was no extra risk because if they were to spread COVID to each other, it would have already happened. Now, here we can say whether 100 workers should all have been frequently mixing at this period of time. That's an open question. The advice was workers should stay apart as much as possible. If you've got 100 people mixing, probably something's gone wrong. The bigger point, though, is this. We, the public, were not told to make our own judgments when it came to epidemiological risk. We weren't told that if you think that the person you are going to go to a party with, if you had COVID, they would have already had COVID. We weren't told any of that. We were told, follow the rules. Follow the rules, do not break them. And to get an idea of how clear the government were about the importance of following the rules to the letter, I want to show you this bit of government propaganda from the time. So here, focus on that middle panel. It shows someone on oxygen, presumably fighting for their life. And it reads, look her in the eyes and tell her you never bend the rules. Right? But that's what we were all being told. Look her in the eyes, this person who looks like they're fighting for life, and tell her you never bend the rules. Now Michael Fabricant is going on television and saying, if you didn't bend the rules, you're a cold fish. If you didn't bend the rules, you're someone who feels no compassion for the people you work with. Because if someone is working hard and you don't bend the rules to let them have a party with gin and tonics and beer and sausage rolls, then you're the problem. You're the one who has acted immorally. So it's similar to the Dominic Cummings situation. Not only are we being told they're allowed to break the rules and we're not, we're now being told if you didn't break the rules, that's a moral failure of you. By breaking the rules, they were being the morally righteous people. It's the rest of us schmucks who not only missed out on good times by not going to these parties, but actually we were the ones who were morally lacking by not having rule-breaking parties. Dalia, I mean, they have no shame, do they?
I mean, that wig tells me that they have no shame. Speaking of public health risk, every time I see that wig, I swear I come out in hives. But I think you're right to draw a broader brush here than just looking at Boris Johnson. I think it's important here to frame this as a government problem, not just a Boris Johnson problem, because I think there's a risk here that we're seeing in the press of over focusing on Boris Johnson. Did Boris Johnson attend the party? Yes or no? Obviously, that's a pertinent question. He is the leader of this country. He is ultimately responsible for what happens. But I think framing this as a personal, eccentric error of judgment or a sign of Johnson's unique contempt for the British public, it's clearly not just about that. This party was attended by 50 people. The email invite went out to 100 people, and it was, I assume, sent under the assumption or with the confidence that none of those 100 people would push back or tell the press. We now know, obviously, that some did, but I'm sure the person who sent the email thought it was perfectly fine. And there was a confidence that if the press did find out, the press wouldn't report on it. And that they'd essentially still be able to get away with it. This is a Conservative Party problem. And in fact, I would argue it's actually a British establishment problem because it is rooted in that one rule for them, one rule for us logic. Now, I want to know how many members of the press knew or have known that was happening. And why didn't we know about it at the time? I think, there is a compelling argument to say that they shouldn't have reported it at the time, because at the time we really needed everyone to follow restrictions, to follow the guidelines. And if it had been reported in the middle of that the government were having a party of 50 people, then chances are people would just stop abiding by the regulations, and that would cause a crisis in confidence and a public health crisis. Okay, I can be sympathetic to that argument, but the least the press could have done, knowing that this is what was happening behind the scenes, and we don't know exactly if anyone did know, but chances are, these spheres are very porous. A lot of people move between them. Surely the least you could have done is not done the government's bidding for them, the government's narrative bidding for them. Because at this time, when scientific advisors were advising one thing, the government was not following that scientific advice. We were having an astronomical number of hospitalizations. We, at that time, the media was essentially continuing this idea that, we shouldn't criticize Boris Johnson because we're in the middle of a crisis, or he's just doing the best he can in really difficult circumstances. And so that is sort of part of this issue. It's not just Boris Johnson himself. It's the press, it's the Conservative Party as a whole, it's the armed police officers that Michael Fabricant has said were probably there at the time, to think that the police were beating the crap out of Sarah Everard protesters at the same time as protecting this party that was going on in the middle of lockdown. It's absolutely just appalling, and it shows us again that it's one rule for them and one rule for us is the central organizing logic of this government and the British state, the press, the police as a whole. And we've seen that one rule for them, one rule for us in this case, and we know it from that longer record. So I think it's really important to not focus too much on Boris Johnson, even though I understand we want to get him to resign because he doesn't have, there's a crisis in confidence and we need that for public health. But also, what does this tell us about it? It's not going to just be fixed. This culture of impunity, this culture of entitlement is not going to be fixed by just replacing Boris Johnson with someone else.
Got a comment from Kieran Buckley with Super Chat. Johnson should be removed, but I'm more terrified of Rishi Sunak being PM, being more competent in the eyes of the public and more right-wing. I do kind of share that sentiment. What's relevant there, though, is, Dalia's been talking about how it's not just Boris Johnson involved. There are many people implicated. Now, guess whose garden backs on to the Downing Street? Sorry, guess whose window backs on to the Downing Street garden? It's the window of Rishi Sunak's Treasury office. He has an office in number 11 Downing Street. Sorry, not Treasury office, his office in number 11 Downing Street, where the Chancellor lives. And he would have seen, if he was in that day and it was a lockdown, so people weren't really going anywhere else, he would have seen this party take place. So this is a person who is favourite to replace Boris Johnson, who was living next door to where all of these illicit parties happened. So, again, we could suggest that he might not have wanted to have made that public because it would have damaged sort of public confidence in the rules as they were, and for public health reasons that confidence was important. But I would hope that he can present some sort of evidence that he was sending messages at that point in time saying, Boris Johnson, I can see all of these parties that are going in your garden. Do you think this is seriously a good idea? Now, I doubt those messages exist, but I would hope those are the kind of questions that are asked of Rishi Sunak when he inevitably stands to replace Boris Johnson at the point, be that sooner or later, when he does resign. Conmac tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, the Boris Johnson fan club MPs trying to claw at absolutely anything they can to stay afloat. It would be hilarious if these people weren't in a position of power. Absolutely. Although I haven't actually seen, it's going to be interesting over the next couple of days who does come out and defend Boris Johnson. I think now that he's apologised, they'll say, oh, well, look, it was the wrong thing to do, but he's apologised and there's an investigation going on. As I say, other than people like Michael Fabricant, the complete headbangers, everyone has basically been completely hiding for the past 48 hours. Let's go on to another aspect of this story. Has Boris Johnson's web of lies finally come undone? What's certain is his admission in Parliament that he did, in fact, attend a lockdown party contradicts much of what he said over the past month. Let's take a look.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10.
We had events the whole time. We had events for Hanukkah. We turned the Christmas lights on. We do all sorts of things in number 10 and in accordance with the rules as you would expect.
What I can tell you is that all the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed. But I repeat, Mr. Speaker, that I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured. But as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence I can see is that people in this building have stayed within the rules. If that turns out not to be the case, and people wish to bring allegations to my attention or to the police or whoever, then of course there will be proper sanctions. I can tell you once again that I certainly broke no rules.
So, in summary, Boris Johnson said that all guidance was followed at all times, that everything done in Downing Street was done in accordance with the rules, that there was no party, that no rules were broken, that people in Downing Street had always stayed within the rules, and that Boris Johnson himself had personally broken no rules. Now we know there was a party, it was outside the rules, and Boris Johnson knew about it because he was there. Boris Johnson has once again been found out. And I say once again because Boris Johnson's history of lying is well known and it stretches back for decades now. The story begins back in 1988 when Johnson, working for The Times, made up a quote from an Oxford Don who happened to be his godfather. The made-up quote inspired a complaint. Boris Johnson was fired. Britain's media establishment would ultimately be forgiving of Johnson. After leaving The Times in disgrace, he was hired as editor of The Spectator, a position he used to spread, you guessed it, more lies. This leader was published in 2004. So under Boris Johnson's editorship, the deaths of more than 50 Liverpool football supporters at Hillsborough in 1989 was undeniably a greater tragedy than the single death, however horrible, of Mr. Bigley. But that is no excuse for Liverpool's failure to acknowledge, even to this day, the part played in the disaster by drunken fans at the back of the crowd who mindlessly tried to fight their way into the ground that Saturday afternoon. Boris Johnson only acknowledged that lie and slur in 2012 when an independent inquiry revealed that the disaster was caused mainly by police failures which were covered up.
I'm glad that this independent report has finally nailed the myth that drunken fans were in any way responsible for the deaths of 96 innocent people. That was a lie that unfortunately, very, very regrettably, got picked up in a leader in The Spectator in 2004, which I was then editing. And I went to Liverpool to apologise unreservedly for that mistake, and I repeat that apology today.
Very regrettably, like it's just a little accident that happened, not something which fits into a pattern of behaviour. And I talk about patterns of behaviour because also in 2004, Johnson lied to then leader of the opposition, Michael Howard. That was about his affair with writer Petronella Wyatt.
Let me ask you about a barefaced lie. When you were in Michael Howard's team, you denied to him you were having an affair. It turned out you were. And he sacked you for that. Why did you lie to your party?
Well, with great respect, on that, I never had any conversation with Michael Howard about that matter. And, I don't
You did lie
propose... Well, I don't propose to go into all that again.
I don't blame you.
No, well, why should I? I've been through, that question a lot with the.
Okay.
Watch the documentary.
Okay.
Why don't we talk about something else?
After that lie, Johnson was sacked from the Tory front bench. Let's go back to his record in journalism. Johnson's lies at the Times and Spectator didn't stop him getting a regular column at the Telegraph. In that paper, besides deploying some well-publicised racist language, he also printed a few more whoppers. In January 2019, he claimed that a no-deal Brexit was the most popular option amongst Britons. It was a lie, and the Telegraph issued a retraction. On the 3rd of June 2019, he claimed the UK's economy was set to become the largest in this hemisphere. Again, an obvious lie in that case, and again, another retraction. Back in 2011, he claimed he had been a visiting professor of European thought at Monash University in Melbourne. That was another lie, and a self-aggrandising one. According to Tom McTague of The Atlantic, Boris Johnson had visited the university in the 80s, but it was just on a 2-week fellowship. Max Hastings was Johnson's old boss at the Telegraph. He had this to say about him after he became Prime Minister.
Made of his job so far as Prime Minister?
Well, it's turned out pretty much as you'd expect, that he's always been a fantasist. He's never had much grip of reality. He was a brilliant journalist, and when I wrote a book about my time as editor of the Daily Telegraph, I included him. I said he was one of my favourite colleagues because he did a wonderful job for us as our correspondent in Brussels. But if somebody had said to me all those years ago that Boris Johnson wanted to be Prime Minister or be Prime Minister, I'd say anybody who make Boris Prime Minister must be out of their mind. But the idea of Johnson as Prime Minister, I think he's less fit to be Prime Minister than my Labrador.
Now let's go back to his political career. Johnson's resignation from Michael Howard's front bench was followed by a successful run for London mayor. From that platform, he became the most high-profile backer of Brexit. In that role, he falsely claimed Brexit would bring £350 million per week into the NHS and that Turkey was about to join the EU. Those lies didn't stop him becoming Foreign Secretary and then, ultimately, Prime Minister. In that position, his habit for porkies continued. In 2019, Prime Minister Johnson was accused of lying to the Queen. This accusation came after a Scottish court ruled that his government's advice to Her Majesty over proroguing Parliament was misleading.
Did you lie to the Queen when you advised her to prorogue, to suspend Parliament?
Absolutely not.
A few weeks later, after the Supreme Court agreed with the Scottish court, Johnson was reported to have personally apologised to the Queen for deception. More recently, in last week's Prime Minister's Questions on the 5th of January, a couple of weeks ago, Angela Rayner accused Johnson of having said that fears about rising inflation were unfounded. Johnson denied having ever said any such thing, but Rayner had the receipts. This is from October 2021.
I understand are you worried about inflation?
Well, people have been worrying about inflation for a very long time. I'm looking at robust economic growth. And by the way, those fears have been unfounded.
He just can't stop. Dalia, it has been a source of endless frustration how often Boris Johnson gets away with lying. He's lied throughout his journalistic career, kept getting promoted, lied throughout his career as a politician, kept getting promoted. There is a kind of poetic justice, isn't there, if it's these lies that finally brings him down.
Yeah, I mean, this is Boris Johnson's MO. I'm not surprised in the slightest that he thought he'd get away with this, because history has told him that he will get away with it. That has been the MO of his entire life. And Johnson is actually quite unique because he was actually very well known amongst the British public before he became Prime Minister, before he even became leader of the Conservative Party. We kind of had a pretty good idea of who he was. That doesn't happen normally. You know, most people had never heard of David Cameron until he became leader of the Conservative Party and ran for Prime Minister. Most people had never heard of Jeremy Corbyn until he became the leader of the Labour Party and ran in a general election. So we actually, with Johnson, had quite a lot of data on who he was. And so it's really a wonder to pick up off what was said in those clips. It's a wonder how he actually became Prime Minister to begin with, given how much we knew about his tendency to be corrupt, to lie, etc. And I think there's something to the idea, to the question of why is this the lie that might end his premiership, or it seems to be the one that is impacting him the most. You could argue that it's because the stakes are higher. We're in a pandemic, but I feel that that's sort of been true throughout the pandemic. You know, we've known about these kinds of half truths, this kind of tendency to not be upfront throughout the pandemic. It's had an impact throughout the pandemic. I think that unfortunately, it's because, unlike his previous lies and his reckless comments, the targets here aren't just Black people. They aren't just Muslim women. They aren't just gay men, as they, you know, famously have been. It's everyone. The impact, the people it's implying is everyone. And unfortunately, I think had we listened more closely to what those communities had to say before about the moral fabric of this man, about who this man is, what he does with power, then maybe we wouldn't be in the position that we're in today.
I think that's a super important point. You know, I think you're right. It's that it affects so many people this time. It can't just be, oh, he's only affected some minority, so we don't have to worry about it. It's also is very easy to understand. So, I mean, when it comes to, you know, the £350 million for the NHS, I think even Dominic Cummings is, essentially all but admitted that they just said that to start a row. They didn't really believe that it was going to be, the NHS was going to get an extra £350 million. But it was a very complex issue whether or not that did happen. Here, parties were banned. He was at a party. Very, very obvious. You don't have to be an expert in anything to know that the guy has lied to us. A couple of comments. Tad Cantwell on a super chat says, would it be worth it for Starmer to call a motion of no confidence to force Tory MPs to back the PM and use that at the next election? Interesting idea. I suppose maybe the reason he wouldn't do that is because it could give Boris Johnson sort of a victory. You know, you don't want to interrupt while your enemy is making a mistake. He's definitely, flip-flopping around making a mistake. And can see your argument, because then you could say, oh, this MP backed Boris Johnson. But I'm not sure if that's going to be the strongest argument against him at the next election. Interesting idea, though. And tweeting on the hashtag Tisky Sour Lamb Chop says, it's almost as if we're being governed by anarchists. You do so. Yes, but anarchists, but they know that they'll get to rule whatever, or they've assumed they'll get to rule whatever, even if they break the rules. Hopefully, that's now coming to an end. Final story. A New York judge has ruled that Prince Andrew must face allegations that he sexually assaulted a sex-trafficked 17-year-old girl in 2001. You can see Virginia Giuffre pictured here in this now infamous picture with Prince Andrew. Andrew's lawyers had argued he was immune from civil action from Virginia Giuffre due to a confidential agreement she signed with Jeffrey Epstein in 2009. That settlement asserted that Giuffre would not be allowed to sue any other people connected to Epstein. It was a risky move for Andrew to use a paedophile's payoff to protect himself from a lawsuit, to protect himself, and it really hasn't paid off. The judge has ruled against the idea that the confidential deal protects Andrew, in part because it was confidential. How can it protect you if you weren't supposed to know about it? The judge also rejected arguments from Andrew's lawyers that the allegations from Virginia Giuffre were too vague and unspecific to warrant a suit. The judge wrote the following. Giuffre's complaint is neither unintelligible nor vague nor ambiguous. It alleges discrete incidents of sexual abuse in particular circumstances at 3 identifiable locations. It identifies to whom it attributes that sexual abuse. Now, Giuffre's lawyers will be free to demand evidence of claims central to Andrew's defence, including the contention that he was scared sweatless in the Falklands War and that he was at a pizza party in Woking on the night Giuffre accuses him of first assaulting her. Andrew's choices are now limited. He can appeal the judge's decision, but other than that, or if that fails, he will either have to go to court or settle. Judge Kaplan has slated the case to be heard between September and December this year, and given this is the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, that could be a disaster for the royal family. Dalia, what do you think will happen now? Will he go to court? Will he settle? What do you see happening next?
Well, I mean, he should go to court. Why shouldn't he? If any of us were told by a judge that we had to stand trial, we wouldn't be able to just hide away in a mansion at the expense of the state and just ignore it. We would have to do what we've been asked to do. And this is what I mean by the one rule for them, one rule for us. logic is at the heart of the British state. It's at the heart of the British establishment. The monarchy is obviously part of the British state, and it's part, obviously, basically the epitome of the idea of the British establishment. I think that the most likely thing is that he will settle, because I think that the idea of him giving evidence, the idea of him being questioned, in a trial of this kind, a highly reported trial, the way that the monarchy tends to deal with these kinds of things is to just try and keep things, to prevent any information getting into the public eye. They would much rather throw money at something to keep it quiet than have anyone give any data, anything to people that can be twisted. And that's why, and particularly because, as we know from the Meghan and Harry coverage, the US press is much more willing to portray the royal family in a negative light. There's a kind of informal agreement between the monarchy and the British press that they don't cover, they don't draw attention to stories that put the monarchy in a negative light or that the monarchy don't want out there. The US press doesn't really care about that. They're more than happy to kind of report anything on the royal family as long as it's of public interest. So I think the royal family will do everything they can to prevent that from happening. But that is an injustice, because when you settle and when you are giving in to this idea that, again, the elite can get away with things that we can't get away with. And this is not fundamentally about Prince Andrew. This is about those young girls that were sex trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein, who deserve to have the people that they are accusing of being involved in that sex trafficking ring to have their day in court. They deserve that. And they don't deserve to be called unintelligible. They don't deserve to be called crazy by the British monarchy, by representatives of the monarchy. They deserve to have all of those who are alleged to have been involved in that in any capacity forced to testify on what actually happened. Because the hush money, the kind of settling out of court, it doesn't bring the kind of justice that having him confront his actions, his alleged actions, would have. So I think he will probably settle rather than stand trial. And I think that goes to show, again, what we've spoken about throughout the show, that there is one rule for the British establishment and one rule for the British people.
I mean, of course, we're talking about what Prince Andrew will decide. Virginia Giuffre also has a choice. If Andrew wants to reach a settlement, she has to agree to it. Apparently, it would, if it happened, amount to around £5 million, but it will only be possible if she agrees. Reports have suggested she's not particularly keen to settle at this point in time, but I mean, it's also worth considering that's